Welcome to episode 16 of Forest Focus. I'm your host, Paul Wade, with the Regional Public Affairs and Communications Office. In this show, Steve Dunsky, our film producer, historian, and Forest Service employee for more than 30 years, had the pleasure of speaking with Char Miller about the 50th anniversary of the National Environmental Policy Act. I'll let Steve take it from here and introduce his special guest.
Thank you, Paul. Dr. Char Miller is W.M. Keck Professor of Environmental Analysis and History at Pomona College near Los Angeles. He teaches classes on U.S. environmental history, water in the West, and public lands. He's received numerous awards for his teaching and scholarship, and he's also a senior fellow at the Pinchot Institute for Conservation and a fellow of the Forest History Society. He has served as a consulting historian for more than a dozen documentaries, including The Greatest Good, about the history of the Forest Service, in which he also plays a leading role. And he has written numerous books, including Gifford Pinchot on the Making of Modern Environmentalism, the definitive biography of the first chief of the Forest Service, Gifford Pinchot. He also teaches classes for future forest leaders of today's Forest Service. So, Char, it is absolutely a pleasure to be with you again today.
Well, thank you, Steve, so much. And this is really fun, especially in a COVID world where we can still have these kinds of conversations, even if not face-to-face.
Anniversaries always provide an opportunity to talk about history. And today we're going to talk about the 50th anniversary of the National Environmental Policy Act, which was signed into law on January 1st, 1970. And first, I'd like to just kind of take the broad view, because that's what historians do. And according to your bio and what I know of you, you're an environmental historian. Could you just talk a little bit about what is environmental history, and when and why did it emerge, and what can we learn from it?
Oh, that's great. Thank you, Steve, so much. It's always fun to talk about one's profession, but particularly in this context. And as you well know, one of the things that's interesting about the scholarship in broadly environmental studies is that it appeared in the exact same year that NEPA was signed into law, in part because of, whether it was the Cuyahoga River in Cleveland or the oil spill in Santa Barbara, or the broader emergence of a much more widely understood to be environmental set of needs, whether it's air pollution, water pollution, fires, and the like. Sometime in the late 60s, early 70s, a bunch of historians, separately, without having conversations with one another, started to teach classes that essentially were environmental history. That is to say, what environmental historians try to do is to look at the relationship between human beings and nature and how that relationship changed over time. The really exciting stuff has gone in so many different directions, whether it's urban environmentalism and the study of the way in which urban centers interact with natural systems, to the body itself as an ecosystem that we need to think about, and often is said and worked in relationship to toxins, for example. But it's really interesting that those questions are popping about how do we understand the past and its relationship to nature, the environment, those natural systems, at the same time that many of those people who were asking those questions about their scholarly and academic lives would then pivot, because they were very engaged in issues in Cleveland or Los Angeles, at Yale and New Haven and elsewhere that were alive in those communities at that moment. And so, part of the surge of interest that led to NEPA, which we're now celebrating at the 50th year, actually led to all sorts of other things. And so almost immediately, literally in 1970, Santa Barbara, the University of California at Santa Barbara, started the first environmental studies program. And, it took off like a shot after that. I went to a small undergraduate school in Claremont, California called Pitzer College, which is 2 blocks away from where I now teach. And it had environmental courses that same year, and I was able to take some when I was there as an undergraduate a couple of years later. And so it was like wildfire in a sense, moving very, very quickly. But that also means that historians as activists, as well as scholars, has posed one of the sort of central dilemmas for the profession itself, which is like, how can you abstract yourself from the very things that you're deeply embedded within? And that's a challenge. But it's also a challenge that I think is driven by the passion that people feel this way, whether it's, you're concerned about birds or you're concerned about lynx or owls or whatever it may be. One of the reasons why you love studying that, one of the reasons why foresters do what they do is they actually adore the things that they're working on, and that gives you a kind of fuel that enables you to do it. And so it's not a surprise, at least in retrospect, that NEPA and the Endangered Species Act and Clean Air and Clean Water Act and a host of other conservation legislation pop up between 1964 and the Wilderness Act through 1976, and that's the exact same moment when environmental sociology begins, environmental history begins, environmental political studies begin. Because everybody is recognizing that there are needs out there. And one of those needs, interestingly enough, is environmental law. And so you look at the environmental law journals, and they all start to emerge out of law schools in the late 60s, early 1970s. And the irony is, with NEPA and Clean Air and Clean Water for the Forest Service, and let's put it there for a second, you had to hire people who knew about water, who knew about air, who knew about endangered species, but also who could then be involved in the court decisions and cases that immediately emerged, right? So NEPA requires legal expertise. And that meant that environmental lawyers have done very well subsequent to that moment, regardless of the situation. And so we actually built a whole cadre, a whole new set of professions that NEPA helps to galvanize on the one hand, but also symbolically sort of embodies this process. So your question is spot on, because it turns out that I wouldn't be doing the work that I do if NEPA and other laws like that had not come into being.
So it sounds like what I hear you saying is that there was literally something in the air and also something in the water that caused this to happen. There were these environmental problems that needed to be addressed, and they were addressed across a wide range of professions.
Right.
I looked it up. The Environmental Defense Fund was founded in 1967. The Natural Resource Defense Council, 1970. Earth Justice, which was then known as the Sierra Club Legal Defense Fund, 1971.
Correct.
So all these attorneys, as you said, get on board because now they have something they actually have some standing. They actually have some basis for pressing their cases against the federal government.
Yeah, well, I was going to say that one of the ironies of NEPA in that regard is that NEPA was necessary because none of the land management agencies had any interest in public comment and opening up their doors to commentary about what they were going to do on grasslands, national wildlife refuges, national forests, national parks. So peculiarly, and I guess ironically and perhaps unhappily, the agency's resistance to public commentary and engagement is what led to NEPA. And NEPA led to the lawsuits that now make the lives of many in the Forest Service, let's just say, fatiguing.
So that's a major shift for an agency like the Forest Service, where previously the foresters were out there in the forest doing their thing. We were the experts, the Forest Service, and we sort of told the public how the forest should be managed. Now we're in this other era where the battle has moved to the courts, and for better or worse, we're now, and being a very litigious society, this has been one of the results of the passage of the act for 50 years.
Yeah, no, that's very true, and yet there's a brand new piece in the Journal of Forestry that makes it very clear that the Forest Service has won most of those legal challenges, that they have shifted towards the sort of exemptions that are allowed under NEPA. And that's one of the issues with NEPA itself, is that it is a regulatory law on the one hand, but it also is largely determined by the administrative agency. So National Park Service, Forest Service, and others help to shape its action. But I think in that regard, it's kind of a window into American culture, not just in the 70s, but as the law has evolved and the arguments have evolved and the challenges have adapted over the years. From a historian's point of view, this is like manna from heaven, because it means, oh my God, there's another change, and let's go write about that thing, because that's really interesting. So I thank you guys very much for that.
I think that the reason that we're winning, one of the arguments, the reasons that we're winning these lawsuits is that we try to bulletproof these environmental impact statements. We try to make them litigation proof, but that causes the process for actually writing these documents and getting all the comments from the public, that can often take years, if not decades. And so that's kind of been one of the complaints, or one of the issues surrounding the implementation of the act.
Yeah, that's very true. And yet, in my optimistic Pollyanna sort of view, that's what democracy is, right? If you're trying to bulletproof it, it means you're actually doing your due diligence. And that's a really, really good thing. The last thing that I would say as an analogy we want the Federal Drug Administration to do is to quick time its decisions, even though, with vaccines and the like, we really need a faster way of doing some of this. We want, and that's what the progressive era also wanted, which established the Forest Service, which established the FDA, which established the Park Service. We wanted careful, thoughtful, effective management of whatever the system might be, whether it's food, drugs, forests, or parks. And it is, of course, it's messy and it's contentious and it's mind-numbing at times. I can only imagine. But in the end, you've actually written better environmental impact statements than if you just threw it together. And if I can give an analogy, or not an analogy, but let me just jump to one of the most extraordinary ones that is actually the very first, which is the Trans-Alaska Pipeline. It helps us understand just what happened. And so one of the things that I was really impressed by with President Nixon's comments about NEPA when he signed it was not simply the sort of boilerplate language that I thought about this, and this is the decade when we should solve these things, and he's talking about the 1970s. But he also said, what we don't want to do is add more bureaucracy. We don't want to add more delay and the like. And I'm reading that, and I've read that many times. And this is the first time I looked at it and went, oh my God, he's being prescient. He is a smart guy, so that's really important. But the interesting thing to me was that the same day that he signed that bill that created NEPA, that would ultimately create the Environmental Protection Administration, because NEPA preceded EPA, and it required the EPA to be created. The same day, January 1, 1970, the BLM announced that it was going to create an 800-mile long access road along the Trans-Alaska Pipeline. 6 days later, the Interior approved that utility road and approved it based on an 8-page environmental impact statement. Oh, we all wish we could write one like that. Except, not only was it published on the 7th, but it got sued within, a week or two, as being inconsistent, too small, too short, not thorough enough. And how could it have been thorough? It was written in about 5 days. And so BLM went back to the board for the next year, produced a 246 5-page environmental impact statement that even the Interior Department, before it released it, said it's not detailed enough and it's not effective enough. And so another year went by. This is Nixon's nightmare. And produced a 6-volume, three volumes of appendices that required 175 person years to produce at the tune of $9 million, which in 2020 is $58 million. It seems crazy that the very first one is the precursor for everyone after that, right? That it established a pattern of it wants public comment and litigation, and it also created this self-sustaining industry internal to the agencies because you now needed people who were NEPA proficient and whose only job really is effectively, and I take that from y'all, is to work on NEPA challenges and to make them, as you say, Steve, bulletproof. And also on the outside, produced a whole set, a cadre of lawyers for NRDC and other organizations who are also NEPA proficient because they have to be. And so you get this battle of NEPA smart people fighting one another on the inside or outside to produce ever better environmental impact statements that will help you do the work that you want to do on a forest or a park or a refuge or whatever it may be. But I think, again, as I said, the fact that this happens on the exact same day tells us something really interesting about the speed and actually the sort of parallels by which the law is created and it is already being tested. Absolutely fascinating.
Well, the rapidity with which they brought this proposal forward, as well as their environmental impact statement, like you say, a week later, basically after the law was signed, sort of begs the question about whether they were sort of already anticipating that this law would essentially give them a free pass. In other words, is there some sense in which agencies would then say, okay, we've done our due diligence. These environmentalists will now go away because we've shown that we're not going to have a negative impact or we can mitigate those impacts, and therefore let's just move on. I think about the Endangered Species Act the same way. A lot of people thought that just applied to charismatic megafauna. They weren't thinking about snail darters and other small critters that were getting in the way of big federal projects.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right. And if they thought that passing NEPA meant that environmentalists would go away, the last 50 years has proved that thought wrong. But you know, the notion of public comment, which came out of sort of environmental issues in the great outdoors, were also being driven by, and rarely do people talk about, the really, to my mind, in many cases, the far more damaging decisions that city planners were making to places like New York and Boston and Philadelphia and Los Angeles and elsewhere, where they just took out the bulldozers and ran through neighborhoods without ever talking to anybody. And sort of flattening neighborhoods of color and working class white neighborhoods just because they could do that. And so as much as we in the sort of environmental world and in the land management world think that NEPA is really only about us because that's the world we occupy, do keep in mind that you watch any freeway, and I don't care which freeway you pick, it has run through poor neighborhoods because that's the least resistant area. And they can afford to do it and did it. Just look at the way in which a former Embarcadero freeway just tore through San Francisco. The same with what was the old 17, now 880, as it runs down on the east side of the bay, just ripped through Oakland and other places. And God knows, in Los Angeles, drop a freeway and you can be sure that it was dropped on people that did not live in Beverly Hills. And so there's this whole world that is protesting this process, and it converged. It converged in Congress, not just about endangered species, but endangered neighborhoods. And I think that's a really important component of this process.
So was NEPA, I don't know the answer to this, was NEPA the first act that really allowed for that level of public participation, comment, scoping, et cetera? Or were there other local laws or state laws that actually preceded it?
That's a really good question, because my framework has always been the national in this regard. I think one of the ways to think that through is that NEPA preceded the California Environmental Quality Act by about 6 months. And it too includes public comment. And so there's a way in which you pass NEPA at the federal level, and states then start to mimic what's in the federal law. And then that forces at the state level these kinds of environmental impact statements of one form or another. So when the California highway system, the Department of Transportation is starting to build freeways, that's state money, and they have to do EISs, which they never had to do before. And in effect, cities have to, sort of follow that lead, because they too are going to do it. So, but I don't know the timing of this. I would say, from what I know about the impact that NEPA has on state level legislation that followed it, my guess is there surely is a top-down component to this process. I wouldn't be surprised if there were particular places that worked in the opposite direction, where it was a grassroots effort, but mostly like in Boston and elsewhere, San Antonio, New Orleans, and the like, where protests erupted around highways. They went after the federal government because they thought, whether it was Lyndon Johnson in Texas, because he was such a proponent, and so willing to sort of push on this, that, it's a really interesting issue, that the grassroots actually demand federal action, and that federal action ultimately trickles down to the grassroots.
Let's step back a second too and talk more specifically about the Act. And I want to read to you the preamble to the Act, which kind of outlines the lofty ambitions of the people that wrote it. And listen to this for a sec. The preamble says, to declare national policy which will encourage productive and enjoyable harmony between man and his environment, to promote efforts which will prevent or eliminate damage to the environment and biosphere, and stimulate the health and welfare of man, to enrich the understanding of the ecological systems and natural resources important to the nation, and to establish a Council on Environmental Quality. I mean, that's some pretty lofty stuff for basically an act that's going to be used to review federal projects.
Yeah, it is, isn't it? And I think it is. But I love the fact that it's so lofty, right? Because that becomes the touchstone. If you want to encourage people to think about their relationship to natural systems and more broadly the environment, whether urban, rural, suburban, whatever it may be, this is the act for you. This is a signal that the federal government thinks these things, or in this case, the Congress, thinks these things are vitally important. I love the notion of the biosphere, right? That the very language, which is so 1970s, is consistent with this sort of, often people will talk about that wonderful photograph of the Earth from the moon as being symbolic of the degree to which some humans were able to abstract themselves from their tiny little lives and see the fact that they're in this bigger solar system, for goodness sake, as being consistent. And that's sort of the biospheric notion, that you step back and you realize that you are, involved in a larger process that you need to think about, so that the air you breathe, the water you drink, the soil that grows your food, the trees that ultimately build your home, the various resources, whether mineral or whatever, that make it possible to live the way that we do, these all come with costs, obviously benefits. I love electricity, so that's a good thing. But it comes with a cost, right? How it's generated and who bears the cost of that generation depends on where they live and whether they're using coal or fuel or gas or solar or whatever. And I think that loftiness is, as you say, sort of seemingly at odds with the minuscule that the EISs are required to sort of probe. But if done rightly, there's a direct line between the daily work that someone who is a NEPA specialist is doing and this broader global notion that we live on this planet. This is what we've got. And that we should be thinking, even at the smallest moment, and whatever the fatigue is, that there's a relationship between the work that one does to make these land management plans sustainable and the earth that we're all trying to sustain. I say we all are. Obviously, we're not. Otherwise, we wouldn't have NEPA, wouldn't need it. But I actually like the fact that it takes the moonshot literally, figuratively, and says these are the big ticket items that we're conceiving as being driven here. But I will also say that those who wrote that legislation, those who were most engaged, were actually also disillusioned by the degree to which what happened was exactly what many in the Forest Service, Park Service, and elsewhere wrestle with, which is, my God, we are so deep in the weeds that we can't see our way up into the stratosphere. And so, that's the nature of legislation. It grows a life of its own. It builds a life of its own, and in some ways goes far beyond what its originators imagined, and in some cases, gets trapped into a kind of eddy from which it can't move.
I like the fact that it also says, it states that one of the purposes of the act is to enrich the understanding of the ecological systems and natural resources important to the nation. That implies these documents that the work of the NEPA planners, the work of the agencies, is to actually uncover information that will be useful in understanding how these systems work. So these are actually didactic in a sense. They're uncovering, they're surfacing research. They're providing information in a context for the public to be able to comment on it.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right. It's a very educative thing that you're going to have to do work, right? And not just making it bulletproof. You're going to have to show us the science that says this is okay. Or here's one set of costs, here's another set of costs, but in the main, we think that this works in a particular fashion. And so it means that the agencies are going to have to hire scientists to figure these things out on the one hand, and it also means that in the report out, if you read these documents, if the public then comments on them, and the public has knowledge that's pretty intense. I mean, that's sat in on sort of public comment periods in urban settings in San Antonio, where I lived for many years. And on the one hand, one felt, okay, this is just a listening session. They're not going to listen to us really, but they're fulfilling, they're ticking the box. But then I started to listen to the people who were giving testimony or talking about these things, and it was mind-blowing to me. I lived in South Central Texas, where water was a crucial issue, and it turns out very clearly that the scientists who were sitting in the audience, both citizen science and those who had PhD after their names, knew way more than the engineers and the others who were probably thinking that this is just droning noise in the conversation. And I actually felt that was a hugely important thing for the media to hear on the one hand, because they picked up on these differences also. So, yeah, I think part of what the originators thought NEPA would do would be to create new scientific knowledge almost on a daily basis, and thought in and of itself, that's a social good. And I think they're right. Whether it's endangered species or water issues, wildland fire, timber cutting, I don't care what it is. You had to learn more than what you thought you knew to make the case in court. And I think that, that's a tough hurdle. Obviously it leads to a kind of, it can lead to a set of dead ends, perhaps. It could seem unworthy, unnecessary, but I think in the end, if I were one of the originators of this document, I would be fearful, even as Nixon was, of the sort of bureaucratization of knowledge inside and outside these agencies, but also would celebrate the fact that if we didn't have NEPA, what would we have? We would have had a trans-Alaska pipeline that just did not care one bit about that Alaskan wilderness through which it blew and the permafrost that it disturbed. We got called, the question got called on all of us, not just the BLM. The question isn't just about the Forest Service and the Park Service and actions they may or may not take. It's on all of us. These are public lands. And so some of this is, I think NEPA forces me as a citizen to be better educated about what I think I know. And it's shocking how little I know, but it helps nudge me in a direction that I think is good.
Well, I think you and I both hold in very high regard the people that are willing to sit down and read these documents, not just because they're paid to as attorneys or whatever, but because they're concerned citizens and really want to know what's happening in their community.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. And there are people like that. Oh, my God, I go to city council meetings now, and it's like, oh, my Lord. And anyway, and some of it is just that people's commitment to democracy with a small d is just kind of astonishing. And even though they take umbrage with a set of decisions, they're back the next week.
Yep.
It's like ennobling to watch that happen.
I agree. Let's talk a little bit about the political environment back in 1970. And I know, obviously, the Vietnam War was happening. There was a lot of unrest, not unlike we have today with the civil rights movement and various other movements, not least of which was the environmental movement and Earth Day. But to some regards, we didn't have the partisan divide that we do today. Is that a fair statement? And maybe talk a little bit about the nature of how this legislation passed.
Yeah, so that's really interesting. And you mentioned Earth Day. Do keep in mind it's 50 years old also, so that's part of the zeitgeist that's sort of in the air nest of this period. But one of the things that is really striking about that period between 1964 and 1976, where we go from the Wilderness Act to the National Forest Management Act of 76, is every one of these bills moved through Congress in a bipartisan manner, and there was very strong Republican support. I mean, really strong, and that reflected. And take the Wilderness Act as an example. None of the land management agencies, federal land management agencies, wanted that bill passed. They fought it tooth and nail for years, and then managed to control the amount of land that would be designated as wilderness in the end. But part of what also happened with that legislation is the Wilderness Society, among other organizations, just worked the halls of Congress day after day after day and I'm sure they were dismayed at various points. But they understood the process, and they didn't just go to Democratic and or Republican, right? They knew that the only way to get this done, to get it done in a way that would benefit the wildness of the United States, but also the political process, was to make sure as many people were on board as possible. Take NEPA as an example. It had 15 no votes collectively in the House and the Senate. Imagine a bill today that would somehow, I can't imagine what the bill would be. Certainly an environmental bill would be very tough, although I say that, and the Land and Water Conservation Fund did go through the Congress last year in a pretty almost unanimous fashion, or a largely bipartisan fashion. But that's the thing that really gives me, intriguingly, a sense of hope. There was a moment in time when the bipartisan coalition was intense, and it was around the very thing that Nixon called out in the first paragraph of the statement, which is, these are crucial issues: air and water. He didn't say soil, but he should have tossed in soil. these things, without this stuff, we don't exist. No species exists. So let's get about fixing these things that we know are broken. And so NEPA was a way to get at that. But he's signing legislation that there was no way he could not sign that legislation. If it only had 15 nay votes, I mean, come on, he's going to have to sign it. It didn't mean he actually likes the bill or that he was going to fund the organization at the level at which it desperately needed to be funded as a startup, the EPA I'm speaking of here. He was not quite happy with that. But he did sign it. And a month and a half later, maybe 2 months later, Ronald Reagan signed CEQA, the California Environmental Quality Act. So, you know, they're not considered environmentalists by any stretch. Like, neither was a green president neither was a green president. Let's just put it right there. But they understood what it was that the public wanted. And maybe, as you suggested earlier, they're doing this as a way to sort of make the problem disappear. Let's sign an act and maybe things will go away. That didn't quite happen. But I prefer the more generous response, which is that they too were caught up in this process. They too, I mean, look, they knew about Los Angeles' air pollution. Both of them did. They lived in it. They knew what the problems were in terms of recreation and major cities, as well as federal lands management of all kinds. And so, you know, I give them that credit in ways that, you know, unfortunately, I can't credit the current president with any of that kind of insight, or the Senate, which has absolutely rarely has any interest in environmental legislation one way or another. But I still see that foundational moment, 64 to 76, as a really critical time, as was the New Deal period in terms of environmental legislation and the progressive era of Muir and Pinchot and Roosevelt, the Audubon Society and elsewise, back in the day, late 19th through, let's call it the end of the First War. We've had three grand moments in which the environment mattered enormously. And it's an environment not just distant from human beings, it's actually an environment in which human beings are deeply involved, which is, again, the preamble, right? Keep the preamble of NEPA in mind. It requires human beings understanding living as natural beings in a biosphere. And we have a hard time with that. But I love the fact that that's the big picture, because it means there's hope for us, right? That they had aspirations for us that sometimes we match and sometimes we don't. But if we don't aspire to something large, we're never going to achieve it.
So let's jump ahead now 50 years to today, and we are celebrating, I think, the 50 years of the passage of the National Environmental Policy Act. Today we're faced with problems that were apparent back then, but have gotten worse in terms of loss of biodiversity, in terms of climate change, in terms of reaching these planetary boundaries, in terms of fisheries and soils, etc. So we have to ask ourselves, you know, has the law been a success? And is it something that needs to be abandoned? Is it a failure that needs to be abandoned, or is it a work in progress that can and should be improved?
Yeah, so you raised some really good questions in that 30-second hit there, in part because NEPA can only do so much. And let's assume for a second there are limits to what it is able to do with us in charge of it. Human beings are pretty damn flawed, and we can see those flaws played out in NEPA as in everything else. But as you say, we at a 50-year moment or a century, you do step back and go, okay, what's been the value? And did it add value to the life of the planet and to biodiversity? There's a couple of ways to answer that, and I want to go back to 1970 to remind us about why NEPA, I think, has been so important. Work in progress, yes. A failure, no. Because if you remember, our streams and our rivers were badly despoiled. There's clear cutting going on private land and public land at a rate that would have denuded many of those national forests that folks today, including me, who love going up in them, celebrate their extraordinary beauty. The air in every major city was appalling. And so look at air quality, water quality, and environmental quality more generally. And one could look at NEPA and say, dear God, whatever its problems, it helped, along with clean air and clean water legislation and the like. I mean, there's that whole list. But as part of that long list, NEPA has had a role to play in shaping how we manage these landscapes and what the sort of baseline must be for that management, right? But I would also suggest, and certainly those inside the agency, all of those agencies are far more savvy about what the limitations of NEPA have been. And, so I draw on an historian by the name of James Skillen, who's written a beautiful book about the Bureau of Land Management called The Nation's Largest Landlord. The title alone is worth everything because it is the nation's largest landlord. But he looked at NEPA as only a part of his history of BLM and has, raised a really essential issue about NEPA as law, which is it iterative and adaptive, or has it become, it's not his word, it's mine, ossified? That is to say, so it's become bone hard. It's brittle in that sense. It's not flexible. And so one of the things that he's proposed is to think about how to, in his words, reduce the front-end preparation, all of that bulletproofing that you described, Steve, and increase post-EIS monitoring. So let's say you wrote less than 6 volumes of an EIS statement and did only 3 or 2 or whatever, but you also invested money in post-EIS monitoring, evaluation, analysis, and critique. The last word is most important. So that you, an agency or a city, could learn from the things that you did or did not do and not do those things again, right? So that there's a sort of flexibility in that process whereby you analyze and re-engage with the very EIS that you've just written, but you do it over a period of time to see if, in fact, what you thought was going to happen, happens. And if it doesn't, then shift. And that gets built into an EIS process. The analogy I might draw, for those of you who know about sustainable architecture, is to a system called LEED, which is one of the tools that helps architects and those who hire architects to sort of build sustainability into their project. So for a college dorm, for example. The problem with LEED, as good as it is, and so the closer you are to for example, a train or a mass transit, you get points for that. The more solar you have driving energy through your building, you get points for that, all those kinds of things. Is that there's no post-construction evaluation. So I actually had a student do an analysis of one of the dormitories at Pomona College in 2012 that had just opened, building that my office was in, and it just opened. And she looked at the LEED report and then went and read every utility bill for the prior 3 years and discovered, not a shock, that the building actually way underperformed relative to what it was supposed to do. Well, if that was the case, the building would not get a LEED Silver certification. It would not even be considered. And so having done that work and shared it with the facilities, part of what the college has decided is that silver's not, you got to go for platinum. You've got to go for the very best. In the hopes that will at least give you some sort of operating space that is more sustainable. But that's kind of a back-ended way to go about these things, right? That if you create a system that doesn't have post-analysis, post-construction, post-EIS, you really don't know whether the thing that you said was going to happen or those things that were going to happen actually happened, and then you just simply move on. No lesson learned. And I think Skillen's point is, let's get some teachers can't do this, right? Students really can't do this. You've got to sort of think through what it is that you did and didn't do and shift it. So what he wants is an EIS that can be responsive, that can be revised, that can be rethought, and then reacted, which I think is a really interesting argument because it works for lots of parts of society. And it may be a way to get out of the tangle of the so-called analysis paralysis, that all we do is analyze and never get beyond that point. Many Forest Service chiefs talked about it in the 90s and the aughts. I think it's a fair point to ask, but that's not the law, the regulation. That's not NEPA's problem. NEPA's problem is the way it's been interpreted. And very little of the interpretation goes back to that preamble, which is, this glorious high-level 30,000-foot vision of what should be going on, but it's way down in the roots, the grassroots. And maybe there are times when we need to bob up to the surface with marine and not so much terrestrial analogies. So I think NEPA has been vitally important on so many levels, not least of which is the politics in which it was fashioned, but also in the way that it shaped how we engage with the decision-making processes as a land management agency, as a city bureau, and the like. And it blew the whistle on a way of constructing the United States that needed to be blown. Maybe we need a different whistle, fair enough, but the devil will be in the details, but also in the commitment.
So I started my Forest Service career in about 1989, so about 20 years after NEPA was passed. I've been with the Forest Service for about 30 years, a little over 30 years. I'd say in the past decade, I've started to hear terms like collaborative stewardship or shared stewardship, adaptive management, terms that seem to imply something similar to what you're talking about, that the planning process has to be collaborative, it has to be adaptable, and that obviously requires monitoring and the ability to change your course over time. I don't know enough about the particular projects that that people have worked on to say whether it's been successful or not, or whether this is more aspirational than operational at this point. But what is your sense about that trend?
Yeah, so it depends on the project. And, on the one hand, I would say, I would say there are two influences on me in this regard, having spent the year 2004 and 5, often in your company, as it turns out, but also traveling around the country as a lecturer for the Forest Service to talk about its history, and engage with communities from Cordova, Alaska to Jacksonville, Florida, from Plymouth, New Hampshire to San Diego, and everywhere in between. Somehow I missed the Midwest National Forest, but I got a lot of the southern ones. I was blown away. I was lucky, right? I flew in and flew out, and could pop into conversations. But often my talks were following the awards ceremonies that forests and districts were giving to those folks that they'd been working with. And it was really heartening to hear the conversations from the podium on the one hand, but also the sidebar conversations before and after my talk of people who, from all sorts of walks of life, from all sorts of NGOs of one form or another, that were collaborating on trails and on endangered species work and what effectively to me was community building and using the forest as a way to build a larger constituent in support of, and to sort of monitor what was happening on these forests. And in a sense, I was watching NEPA at work, but in another sense, I was watching a different kind of engagement that living in South Central Texas, where there's no national forest, no national land at all, I had not seen in quite the same way. There are ways in which that happened. And the other way of sort of thinking this through is because I have the good fortune to work on middle leadership programs in the West, is to meet for the last 10 years or so with hundreds now of folks who are themselves aspiring leaders on districts, in the supervisor's office, up and through the WO, and also people who had just basically joined the agency from one other agency or another, listening to them think about the way in which, if they got into those positions of leadership, how they would be thinking about that collaborative process, which is, I mean, it takes a long time to shift an agency of 25,000 people. But in these individual stories, I feel like I'm hearing that kind of change where that collaborative model is being baked into a lot of the work that people gladly do and want to do. And so I would say those are, to me, where the aspirational piece are, and in good ways, aspirational. The operational is another matter in some cases, right? That depending on the kind of political environment in a community, it's going to be very hard to keep these collaborative groups together as people spin into partisan work, right? That this is, you're coming with an opinion and you're going to fight for it, and you may not win. And so depending on where you live, that may be one thing or another thing. And I've also had those conversations where people say, you know what, collaboration is actually co-optation. It's a way by which to absorb and diminish the sort of collaborative energies that are there, but to shape them in a way that discounts ultimately the kind of engagement that's going on. Again, that's not NEPA, that's politics. And not to put NEPA outside of politics, but I would say that God, these are really tough issues, and because it seems to be place by place, ecosystem by ecosystem, it seems to change. And one of the things that struck me in 04, 05 when I was loping around the country is that that Eastern and Southern National Forests have a very different kind of relationship, or seem to, and I may, again, because I was dropping in, may have missed things. And I attribute that to, in part, the way in which the two sets of national forests became national forests. Because in the East and the South and the Middle West, that was land bought from willing sellers. And that does change the way folks around them tend to feel about them. And the battle over, the Pinchot-led national forest between 1905 and 1910, when he got kicked out of office, that was a battle. I mean, those were public lands, always federal lands. There was no question about that, although people raised the question whether that was actually true. But some people, large numbers of them, felt that the Forest Service was an intruder. And if that's your reputation, then you become an outside force, and you only have to read the memoirs of those early rangers to realize just how tough their life was simply on a social level. They were distrusted. Whether it was in Utah or Santa Barbara, it didn't matter. They were distrusted. And so what they were doing was also felt to be an outside imposition in ways that I don't think the national forests in the East and the South and regions 8 and 9 are often thought of in the same way. So that's going to shape the kind of collaborative notion also, because you're willing to collaborate with someone that you think of as a collaborator from the beginning, or maybe I'm again dreaming about this. But in the end, I think that NEPA, the current administration already wants to announce a new set of regulations by which it operates. And so, anything I just said is going to change the moment that gets announced. And we may see a different 50-year trajectory with NEPA. But, again, that's the nature of democracy. And as I said at one of the outsets, it's like, this is all great stuff for historians, because you change something and all of a sudden I have a story to write.
Well, speaking of history, we're always living through history. We just don't necessarily understand it except in retrospect. But you talked about the impact of the environmental laws of the 70s and how they've improved our air and water quality dramatically in many places. But there have been some communities that still are struggling with those environmental impacts, and often those are people of color and other people that are living in more marginalized communities. I'm thinking about Flint, Michigan, for example,
Sure.
with their water issues. I'm also thinking about a recent decision. We're recording this in July of 2020, a recent decision regarding the Dakota Access Pipeline. Maybe you could talk a little bit about issues around environmental justice, which is a term that probably didn't exist at the time that the act was passed. But how does NEPA play into that, and where do you see this act going forward with regard to maybe these communities that are still suffering from extreme environmental degradation?
Yeah, so there it seems to me is one of the really interesting things that's happened with, and it surfaced, but as an old story, but it surfaced when the White House announced that it had completed its review of NEPA, a process that elicited more than 1 million comments, with thousands of them arguing that without NEPA, the kind of environmental injustices that have happened all over the place for marginal communities, for communities of color, for working class white neighborhoods that breathe bad air, that whose water is toxic laden, who find themselves in not just health deserts and food deserts, but in all sorts of problematic situations. NEPA is actually a tool that they can use to call the question on whether a highway needs to be built, whether a smelter needs to go into our neighborhood, whether a landfill, whether in a national park on the one hand, as in Joshua Tree, has often been threatened, or more likely often in a neighborhood that is thought of as a sacrifice zone. Well, they're poor, they're brown, they're black, they don't have much power, so let's dump a landfill there. NEPA has been crucial as a tool by which to fight that, because of, again, the notion that we really need to do this. And you raised Apple, the Dakota Access Pipeline, and that recent July 2020 decision, in which, at the moment at least, it's been stopped, and it's been stopped because it violates by treaty and other sort of ethical issues why we're choosing to run pipelines through reservations. And the Forest Service is involved in another set of pipelines in the eastern area. Actually, I've been spending a lot of summers recently in the mountains of the western part of the state of Virginia, not West Virginia, but western part of Virginia itself. And there, my God, people are angry as can be that a major pipeline is going to run through the George Washington and Jefferson National Forest. And they're using NEPA to attempt to slow that down. It's kind of awkward and complicated because it's changed here and there. Equally up in New Hampshire, there are issues with the White Mountain National Forest. I mean, these issues aren't going to go away. And because they affect rural areas that, okay, we can just run it through there, or tribal or communities of color in urban areas, we have a lot of work to do. We can solve so many issues, but then there are more that crop up, or those that we didn't think were issues emerge in a new way because of a new moment. And it seems to me that NEPA is a bellwether for much of this kind of conversation because it initiated public comment, and it forced us to have these conversations. And to rob us of that democratic tool is actually to undercut democracy in a way that is deeply troubling. And so regardless of how and where and why one thinks about the National Environmental Policy Act on this 50th anniversary, recognize that it is a mechanism by which the people get to speak to those in power. And that's unusual, right? We now have a tool by which to do that. And it's absolutely essential so that you can stop a pipeline or at least raise the question about why we're making those choices. Because in 1970, that was unusual. In fact, it never happened. So this is something to celebrate, and the very fact that a court backed up the tribes on this is worth a great deal of celebration.
Well, that's great. I love ending this on a note of celebration, and I'm sure that the story of NEPA and the story of all these various projects around the country will continue, and I'm sure that somebody will be having this conversation. I expect that somebody will be having this conversation in another 50 years.
Oh, of course.
So
Absolutely.
Well, thank you so much to Char Miller and Steve Dunsky for sharing their insight and history of NEPA over the past 50 years. For more information on Char and NEPA, we will provide links on our website, which can be found in the show's description. Thank you to all of our guests, and thank you for listening. To learn more about this show, share it, or hear our other episodes, please search Forest Focus Podcast. Subscribe, and if you have questions or suggestions on a topic or area of expertise you would like us to feature, please email us at paul.r.wade@usda.gov. Until next time, enjoy your public lands and remember to recreate responsibly. Know before you go and learn what you can do to prevent wildfires. Take care. This podcast is sponsored by the U.S. Department of Agriculture, Forest Service, and USDA is an equal opportunity provider, employer, and lender.